My name is Astrid Thorvald and I'm 41. The morning the divorce was finalized, I woke up before the alarm. It was 5:17 a.m. I lay in the dark and listened to the rain on the windows. The harbor was a quarter-mile away. I could hear the ferry horn, low and long, the way it always sounded in November. I had lived in this house for 11 years. I knew every sound it made. By 6 a.m., I had coffee. By 6:30 I had the folder on the kitchen table. It was a plain manila folder, slightly worn at the corners. Inside it were 3 documents. I had read them enough times that I could recite every paragraph from memory. I didn't open the folder that morning. I just set it there and drank my coffee and watched the rain move across the window above the sink. The rain came in hard off the sound at this time of year. It had been doing it since September. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke from the night before. I had kept the fire going until almost midnight, not because I was cold, but because I had wanted something to tend. The courthouse appointment was at 9 a.m. I drove myself. The road into town ran along the water, evergreen-lined on the inland side, and the trees were dark and wet. A logging truck came the other way and threw spray across my windshield. I didn't slow down. I had driven that road in worse, in December ice, in fog so low you couldn't see 20 feet ahead, and on the morning after Brendan moved out, when I had driven to the harbor at 5 a.m. and sat there until the sun came up. Each time the road felt the same. This morning felt the same as all of those. Outside the courthouse the rain had eased to a fine mist. A ferry was moving out of the terminal at the end of the block, slow, the way they always looked from a distance. I watched it until it cleared the breakwater. Then I walked inside and took the elevator to the second floor and sat in a chair outside the courtroom with my coat still on until my attorney came to get me. The judge signed the papers at 9:43 a.m. My attorney shook my hand in the hallway. She said it was done. I said thank you. I kept my voice even. I was back at the house by 11:15 a.m. The truck was already in the driveway. It was a black pickup, new, with a tool rack across the bed and mud on the rear wheel wells that hadn't come from our street. My father-in-law, Douglas Osgood, was standing at the front door with a ring of keys in one hand. Behind him stood my brother-in-law, Carter, arms folded, weight shifted back on his heels. Behind Carter stood a man in a gray work jacket I didn't recognize. He had a small canvas bag set down beside his feet. He was looking at the door lock the way a person looks at a problem they have already sized up and priced. Douglas turned when he heard my car door. He was 64, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who filled a doorframe and knew it. He had worked the boatyard south of town for 30 years before I ever knew his name. He had opinions about how things should be handled, and he held them with the confidence of a man who had rarely been wrong about anything practical. He said my name like a courtesy he hadn't fully decided to extend. Astrid, he said. Douglas, I said. You should have called, he said. We were going to make this easier for you. I looked at the man with the bag. I looked at Carter. Carter looked at the ground. I said nothing. Douglas held up the key ring. This house was never yours, he said. He said it loud. The neighbor across the street was out with her dog. She stopped walking. Brendan's name is on this property. Always was. You know that. I have an appointment at the county recorder's office at 1 o'clock, I said. You're welcome to come. He smiled. A patient smile. The kind that meant he thought he was explaining something to someone who hadn't quite understood yet. We won't need to do that. I walked past him to the door. He stepped aside. I put my key in the lock, opened it, went to the kitchen, and picked up the manila folder from the table where I had left it that morning. I walked back to my car and set the folder on the passenger seat. It was 11:22 a.m. I had 1 hour and 38 minutes. I grew up in Astoria on the Oregon coast, the second of 3 daughters. My father ran a small marine surveying operation out of a rented slip on the waterfront. He surveyed vessels for insurance underwriters, for buyers, for banks. He taught me how to read a hull, how to write a condition report, how to find the specific language in a policy that made the difference between a paid claim and a denied one. I was 14 the first time he let me sign off on a survey notation. He checked it twice. He said it was right. He had one rule about condition reports that he repeated often enough that I could have said it in my sleep. Never write what you hope is true. Write what the hull tells you. If the hull tells you the frames are soft, the frames are soft, and the underwriter gets that in plain language. He had lost 2 clients over the years because of that rule. He had never lost his license, his insurance, or his reputation. I understood from an early age that the two things were directly connected, and that the clients who left over honest reports were not the clients worth keeping. On the corner of his desk between the reference volumes sat a flat oak case with a brass latch. Inside it were his survey dividers, brass, 8 inches, calibrated. He kept them there every day I could remember. I went to school for civil engineering at Oregon State. I finished in 4 years and worked for a regional firm in Portland for 3 years after that, mostly infrastructure projects, drainage and grading, state highway work. Nothing that felt like mine. Then my father's business partner retired and my father called and asked if I wanted to come north. I said yes and drove up the same week. By the time I was 30 I was co-owner of Thorvald Marine Survey. My father held 51%. I held 49%. The business was not large, 3 employees, 2 field surveyors and an office manager named Dolores who had been with my father since before I was born. But we had a regional reputation built over 18 years of showing up on time and writing reports that held. Our client list included 2 of the larger marine insurance underwriters operating in Pacific Northwest coastal waters. We were not flashy. We were accurate. In marine survey, accurate is the thing that keeps you in business, because the person reading your condition report is making a financial decision based on what you say, and if you get it wrong, you don't work in this region again. Within 2 years of returning, I had brought in 3 new accounts my father hadn't had before: a regional shipyard, a small ferry operator running routes between the islands, and a recreational marine insurance broker who sent us 2 to 4 surveys a month through the busy season. My father reviewed my reports the first year. After that he stopped and just signed off on the quarterly partnership statements. He said I knew what I was doing. He was right and he knew it, and saying it out loud was not something he felt the need to do more than once. The firm's reputation in the marine insurance community rested on a specific kind of reliability: surveyors who returned calls, who showed up in bad weather and at low tide and before dawn when the schedule required it, who wrote reports that could survive scrutiny from an underwriter's legal team if the situation ever came to that. That reputation was mine to maintain after my father's health began to limit his fieldwork. I maintained it. I did not always enjoy every aspect of that maintenance: the 4 a.m. departures, the tide schedules, the November hull inspections in rain gear when the temperature was in the low 40s and the wind was coming off the water, but I understood that the work itself was the asset, and the asset was mine to protect. I met Brendan Osgood at a marine trade dinner in Bellingham in late October, 11 years ago. He was 30, tall, easy-talking, with his father's build and none of his father's edge. He worked for a commercial contractor that did dock repair and small craft infrastructure along the Sound. He knew the water the way people do when they've grown up near it, not technically, but in the body, in the way they moved around a boat and handled a line and talked about weather without looking at their phone first. He asked good questions. He laughed easily. He didn't try to impress me, which was unusual at a trade dinner where most of the men in the room were trying to impress someone. We dated for 14 months. We married in June. 30 people, a rented hall overlooking the harbor, my father walking me in, my mother crying in the second row. Douglas Osgood sat in the front row on the groom's side and shook my hand afterward with both of his and said I was good for his son. He meant it that day. I believed him. We bought the house 8 months after the wedding. It was a 1940s Craftsman on a quarter-acre lot 2 blocks off the main road and 4 blocks from the harbor. The neighborhood was old working class, the kind where people kept their gutters clean and replaced their fences before they fell down and didn't ask each other's business. The purchase price was $340,000. I put in $204,000, 60% of the total, from savings I had built over 6 years of surveying work. Brendan put in $136,000. The mortgage was in both names. The deed was in both names. That was the part Douglas either hadn't paid attention to at the time or had spent the past 14 months deciding to reinterpret. The marriage lasted 7 years before it didn't. There was no single event I could point to. Brendan drank more than he had. He came home later than he used to. We argued about money more than seemed proportionate to the actual figures involved. We went to counseling for 8 months. It helped some things. It didn't help enough. In February of the year the divorce was filed, he moved out with 3 bags and his tools and said he needed some space. His mother called me 2 days later. Then 3 days after that. Then it was twice a week until the attorneys got involved and my attorney asked her to stop. Douglas's wife, Marlene, was softer than her husband but not separate from him. She called to ask how I was doing. She called to ask if I had thought about what I really wanted. She called once in March to say that Brendan's name on that house meant something to the family, that they had always thought of it as an Osgood house, and that she hoped I would do the right thing when the time came. I told her I understood what she was saying. I didn't say anything else. The divorce took 14 months. Brendan's attorney argued in the third month that the house was a marital asset subject to equal division. My attorney agreed it was a marital asset. She disagreed about the division. She submitted the purchase records, the deed, and the bank transfer documentation showing the wire from my savings account, the amount, the date, and the originating account number. The settlement gave me the house. Brendan received the joint savings account, which held $47,000, and the truck he drove, and no claim on the property. His attorney sent a letter saying Brendan reserved the right to revisit the matter. My attorney filed the response. By October it was over. By November the judge had signed. By 11:15 a.m. on the morning the papers were final. Douglas Osgood was standing at my front door with a locksmith and a ring of keys that meant nothing. I drove to the harbor after I left. I parked in the lot at the end of the terminal road and sat with the engine off for a while. The rain was steady on the roof of the car. I could smell diesel and salt through the fresh air vent. A fishing vessel was moving slowly out of its slip across the water, low in the hull, loaded. I watched it clear the breakwater. Then I checked the time. It was 11:41 a.m. I opened the folder on the passenger seat and looked at the first page. I didn't need to read it. I knew what it said. I just looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have been carrying a long time and are nearly done carrying. Then I closed the folder and started the car. There are things I had done for that family over the years that I had never said out loud, because it didn't seem like the kind of thing you said out loud when you were doing it. In the first year of the marriage, Douglas's boatyard operation ran into a cash flow problem in the spring. A large commercial client had delayed payment on a dock repair invoice, $78,000, 90 days late, and the yard had payroll coming due and not enough liquid to cover it. Brendan came to me one evening after dinner and asked if I could help. He didn't make it dramatic. He just asked. I said yes. I transferred $40,000 from my personal savings into a joint account the following morning and told Brendan to tell his father there was no timeline on repayment. Douglas paid it back 6 months later. He never mentioned it to me after that. 2 years into the marriage, Marlene decided the kitchen in their house needed to be replaced. It had needed it for some time. The cabinets were particle boards swelling at the corners, the floor tiles were cracking along the grout lines. The house was 40 minutes south of ours, a 2-story with a partial water view they had owned since 1989. The contractor estimate came in at $24,000. Douglas said they would do it in stages, which meant it would take 3 years. I offered to cover half. I wrote a check for $12,000 and didn't ask them to pay it back. Marlene sent me a card with flowers on the front. I kept it in a drawer for a while. The year after that, Carter, Brendan's younger brother, Douglas's second son, received his second DUI charge. Not his first. The first had been handled quietly 2 years earlier. This one came with a mandatory ignition interlock requirement, a court-ordered alcohol education program, and an appearance before a judge who had seen Carter's name before. Carter needed a lawyer. Brendan asked if I could help with the fees. I paid $6,500, the full invoice from the defense attorney, and told Brendan I didn't need to be thanked for it. I wasn't. The spring that Brendan's contractor business hit a slow quarter, I took on 2 additional marine survey contracts to make sure the household bills were covered. I paid the mortgage alone for 4 months while his earnings recovered. It was $3,200 a month, $12,800 total across those 4 months, though at the time I hadn't calculated it that way. I thought of it as what a household does when one person's income dips temporarily. I paid and I didn't discuss it. The winter before our wedding, Douglas's furnace failed. January, a hard one, temperature in the 20s inland. No heat for 4 days while they waited on a part shipping from a supplier in Tacoma. Douglas mentioned it to Brendan the way he mentioned most things, as information, not complaint. I drove down on the second day with 2 electric space heaters from the hardware store on the way out of town. Marlene made tea. We sat in the living room and talked about the winter and the house and whether the part would arrive before the weekend. Douglas carried one of the heaters upstairs before he went to bed without commenting on it. When the part arrived and the furnace was running again, I drove back down to collect the heaters. He had stacked them by the front door. He didn't say anything. I took them and drove home. When Douglas decided to purchase a second skiff for charter work out of the harbor, he needed a condition survey completed before the marine insurance underwriter would write the policy. He asked Brendan, who asked me. I did the survey myself on a Saturday morning in April, 4 hours of hull inspection and documentation in weather coming in off the southwest, wind and rain, diesel heavy on the air at the slip. I filed the condition report under my firm's seal and charged him nothing. The insurance rate he received was favorable. He sent Brendan a text that said thanks. The summer Brendan's back gave out, a disc injury he had been managing for 2 years before it finally stopped being manageable. I ran the household alone for 6 months. I scheduled his physical therapy appointments. I drove him to 2 of them when the pain medication made it unsafe for him to drive. I managed the yard through that stretch, kept the gutters clear, and arranged a repair on the back porch that needed doing before the fall rains settled in. I called the contractor, supervised the 2 days of work, and paid the $1,900 invoice. I didn't mention any of it to Douglas or Marlene. It wasn't the kind of thing I mentioned. Carter had a second legal matter 4 years into the marriage, a civil dispute with a subcontractor that had escalated when the other side brought in an attorney. He needed a clear written account of the project timeline to present at the hearing. I drafted the letter on a Sunday afternoon, working through his invoices and work orders, putting together the sequence in plain language a judge could follow. I spent most of the afternoon on it. I don't know what happened at the hearing. He didn't tell me. For 3 consecutive years I prepared the annual marine condition reports that Douglas's boatyard needed for its commercial liability insurance renewal. Each cycle took approximately 12 hours, examining hull maintenance logs, reviewing service records, writing the summaries in the specific format the underwriter required. I charged for materials only, nothing for my time or my firm's seal. Each December he sent a Christmas card. The cards had a printed message inside. His signature was at the bottom in ballpoint pen. 3 years into the marriage, Brendan's contractor license renewal required a continuing education course he had let lapse. The late filing penalty with the state board would have been $850 on top of the course fee. I found an approved provider running an accelerated session, paid the $320 course fee before Brendan had decided whether he was going to deal with it, and emailed him the login. He completed it in 3 evenings. His license renewed on time. The penalty was avoided. In the 7th year of the marriage, Marlene became involved in a property boundary dispute with the neighbor on the south side of their lot. A fence had been erected roughly 4 feet into the Osgood property along the rear boundary line. It was a survey question, technically adjacent to my specialty rather than squarely inside it, but close enough that I could be useful. I pulled the original plat records from the county assessor's office. I reviewed the boundary descriptions against the fence's actual position as Marlene described it. I drafted a letter in plain language, not survey language, but the kind of clear sequential explanation a non-specialist could follow and repeat accurately without losing the argument in translation. I drove 40 minutes south to sit beside Marlene at a meeting at the county assessor's office while the clerk walked through the records, and I translated the technical language into terms she could understand and use. The dispute was resolved in the Osgoods' favor 4 months later. Marlene told me I was a treasure. She said it standing in her kitchen, the one with the new tile floor and the cabinets that didn't swell anymore, the one I had helped pay for. That was 2 years before she called to tell me she hoped I would do the right thing about the house. I thought about that sometimes. I thought about the $40,000 and the 12 hours a year and the Saturday morning at the slip in the rain, my hands on a cold hull I was surveying for free. I thought about Carter's legal fees and the Sunday afternoon letter and the furnace heaters and the drive to the assessor's office and the 40-minute return trip in the dark. I thought about all of it the way you think about a column of figures before you add them up. The folder on the passenger seat had 3 documents inside it. I had looked at the first one. I knew what the other 2 said. I started the car and pulled out of the harbor lot. The county building was 12 minutes away. I had time. The county recorder's office was in a low building on the east side of the municipal block, wedged between the assessor's office and a narrow hallway that smelled of old carpet and copy paper. I had been in that building before. I had sat in that same hallway with Marlene 2 years ago and translated survey language for her while a county clerk walked her through a plat map. I remembered the carpet, the low ceiling, the window that faced east and caught no afternoon light. I knew where the parking was, where the entrance was, which window to approach. I arrived at 12:51 p.m. Douglas's truck was already in the lot. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off. The folder was on the passenger seat. Outside, the lot was nearly empty. A few county vehicles along the fence line, one older sedan near the building entrance, a utility van with a trades company name on the side. The truck was parked close to the door, which was where Douglas always parked in every lot, in every situation, close to the action, visible, positioned to move quickly. I had known they might come. I had issued the invitation in the driveway that morning because I believed Douglas was not a man who could afford not to accept it, who would read a public invitation as a public challenge and respond accordingly. I had been right about that. I was usually right about Douglas. The problem was that being right about him had never, in 11 years, made any practical difference to how things went. He moved through the world by a logic that was entirely consistent with itself, and the consistency was the point. He didn't revise. He regrouped. He found a new angle and came at the same conclusion again. It was what had made him effective in the boatyard trades for 30 years. It was what had made him, during the divorce proceedings, a particular kind of exhausting. I picked up the folder. I checked the time. 12:53 p.m. I got out of the car. He was standing just inside the entrance with Carter beside him, both of them in jackets, Douglas with his arms at his sides and Carter with his hands in his pockets. They had not yet approached the window. They were waiting for me. I noticed that. Douglas did not often wait for anyone. He was usually the one who arrived last and moved immediately, who set the terms of the room by how he entered it. Waiting by the door with his youngest son was something he had calculated would project a particular quality, reasonableness, patience, a willingness to let the process work, and he was probably right about that too. Astrid, he said. Douglas, I said. Carter. Carter nodded once. He looked at the floor, then at the wall, then somewhere between the two. We went to the window. The woman at the window was named Diane. Her nameplate said so. She was in her 50s, efficient, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck and the particular patience of someone who had worked in a public office long enough to have heard most things twice. She had pulled up the property record on her screen before I finished giving her the parcel number. She asked us to sit. We sat at the counter. There were 2 chairs on the public side. I sat in one. Douglas stood behind me. Carter stood behind Douglas. I set the manila folder on the counter in front of me and left my hand resting flat on top of it. Diane asked for identification. I gave her my driver's license. She typed something and looked at her screen. The office was quiet. There was a clock on the wall behind her that I could see clearly. It read 12:58 p.m. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I didn't take it out. I already knew who it was. Marlene had texted me at 12:30 p.m. while I was still in the harbor parking lot. The message had said, Astrid, I hope you will think about what you are doing to this family. You have so much. Brendan has nothing right now. Please. I had read it. I had put the phone back in my pocket and finished looking at the breakwater. Douglas leaned forward slightly. We're here about the Thorvald Osgood property, he said. My son's name is on that deed. Brendan Osgood. We want to make sure the record reflects the correct ownership going forward. Diane looked at him over her glasses. And your relationship to the property? Father of the title holder, Douglas said. The previous title holder, I said. Diane looked at me, then at her screen. I'm showing a recorded transfer, she said. Dated October 14th. The property transferred from joint tenancy, Brendan Osgood and Astrid Thorvald, to sole ownership. Astrid Thorvald. She looked up. That would be you. That's correct, I said. Douglas straightened. His jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that transfer is what we're here about. We believe there were irregularities in how it was handled. Diane looked at him. Irregularities in what sense? In the sense that my son didn't fully understand what he was signing, Douglas said. He was under a great deal of pressure during the divorce process. The agreement was not something he entered into freely, and the attorney he was working with did not adequately explain the long-term consequences of what he was agreeing to. Brendan is not a legal person. He trusted the people around him to tell him what was happening, and he was not told clearly enough. Diane said she wasn't in a position to adjudicate the terms of a divorce settlement. She said if there was a dispute about the settlement's validity, it would need to go back before a family court judge. I understand that, Douglas said. He said it patiently, not dismissively, but with the measured tone of a man who has already processed an objection and set it aside before the other person finished speaking. I'm not asking you to adjudicate anything. I'm asking you to look at what's in your records and tell me whether the transfer was properly executed and whether there's anything in the file that might be relevant to a future challenge. I can do that, Diane said. She looked at her screen. She typed. She scrolled. The transfer was recorded with the required documentation, she said. The deed of sale, the settlement agreement, and the notarized release of interest from the co-holder. Brendan signed a release of interest, Douglas said. Yes. Without being told what that meant, Douglas said. I said nothing. Diane said, I can only speak to what's in the record. The document appears to have been properly executed and witnessed. Douglas looked at me. His face was still, the way it got when he was deciding what to say next rather than saying the first thing that came to him. He had that quality, the deliberateness of a man who had learned at some point that measured speech was more effective than volume, and had practiced it long enough that it had become entirely natural. It was, in its way, the most disciplined version of himself. And it was effective. It was effective because it looked like calmness, and calmness looked like rightness, and rightness was exactly what he had come here to establish. Astrid, he said, I want to give you the opportunity to do what's right here. Brendan is willing to work with you on this. He's not looking to take anything that isn't his. We just want to make sure that house is recognized for what it always has been, which is an Osgood house. It was an Osgood house from the day you moved into it, and it will be an Osgood house long after any of this is settled, because that's what it is. You knew that when you married into this family. I looked at him. I didn't answer. He continued. You had a good life in that house, he said. We welcomed you into it. My wife opened her home to you. She drove to Astoria to meet your parents before the wedding. She sat at your father's table. She made room for you at every occasion we had in 11 years. We treated you like a daughter, Astrid, because you were married to our son, and in this family that means something. And now you're sitting here trying to use a court order to take the one thing that matters most to him. I let the silence hold. I kept my hands flat on the counter on either side of where the folder had been. The clock on the wall read 1:04 p.m. Somewhere outside the building a car door slammed, and then there was quiet again. Carter shifted his weight. He was looking at the counter now. Diane was looking at her screen with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the wisest possible course of action is to appear very busy. Douglas said, What do you think that says about who you are? My throat went tight. I kept looking at him. I kept my face where it was. What do you want me to say? He asked. He wasn't angry. He was asking a genuine question, or performing one so well there was no remaining difference. We're not unreasonable people. We never have been. But you knew what that house meant to Brendan. You knew what it meant to this family. And you went into that courtroom and used a legal advantage to take it from him. I used the purchase records, I said. The money, he said. Yes. You put in more at the purchase. 60%. I understand that. That's what you're calling your claim. But a marriage is not a financial transaction, Astrid. You were part of a family. You had a place in something larger than yourself. The fact that you happen to earn more than my son at a particular point in time does not give you the right to reduce 11 years of his life to a percentage of a purchase price. I'm not reducing anything, I said. I'm applying the law. The law, he said. Yes. He nodded once slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already believed. You know what Brendan said about you when he first brought you home? He said you were the most capable person he had ever met. He meant it as a compliment. He looked at me steadily. I'm starting to think he was more right than he knew and not entirely in the way he meant it. I kept my voice even. Carter said quietly, Dad. Douglas said, Let me finish. Carter looked at the wall. I want you to understand, Douglas said, what this looks like from where we're standing. Brendan is not a wealthy man. He works with his hands. He has always worked. He put everything he had into that marriage and into that house, and now he is renting an apartment 6 blocks from his own front door because you decided your name on a piece of paper entitled you to stay. He paused. He looked at the counter for a moment, then back up. That apartment has a view of a parking structure. I've been inside it. I've sat at his kitchen table and had coffee with my son in a room barely large enough to turn around in, and I've looked at his face across that table, and I want you to understand what I saw there. I saw a man who still doesn't understand what happened to him. Who is still trying to figure out where he went wrong, because he thought he was married to someone who understood what a family was. The room was very quiet. I waited. Then I said, "Is there something else you'd like to say to me, Douglas?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I'd like you to deed the house back to Brendan," he said. "That's what I'd like. You have your business. You have your income. You have every resource you came into this marriage with and more. You don't need that house. Brendan does. It is his home." "It's my home," I said. "It was your home while you were part of this family," Douglas said. He said it carefully and without cruelty, the way you say something you have thought about long enough to say clearly. "You are not part of this family anymore. You are not an Osgood. You stopped being an Osgood when you filed those papers. And that house has Osgood in it, in the structure of it, in every repair Brendan made over 7 years, in the way the front window sits because he adjusted the framing one August when the original wasn't right. You living there alone is you living inside something that does not belong to you." I let the silence hold. He waited for me to answer. I looked at the counter in front of me. The grain of the laminate surface, worn at the edges where people set things down day after day, year after year. The small square of copy paper beside Diane's keyboard with a handwritten note on it I couldn't read from where I sat. I looked at all of it for a moment, long enough that the silence filled the room and became a fact of its own. I said, "He signed the settlement agreement. His attorney reviewed every page. The court approved it. That is what he agreed to." "He trusted you," Douglas said. I said nothing. Douglas looked at Diane. "Can you pull up the original deed? The one from when the property was purchased?" Diane looked at me. I nodded. She typed. The screen changed. "The original deed," she said, "shows a joint tenancy between Brendan Osgood and Astrid Thorvald. Equal shares." "Equal shares," Douglas said. "Equal shares in ownership," Diane said carefully. "The purchase contribution amounts are not recorded in the deed itself. Those would appear in the escrow and closing documentation." "Which are not in this office," Douglas said. "Not here, no," Diane said. Douglas looked at me. Something settled in his face. Not satisfaction exactly, not triumph, which would have been too simple. Confirmation. He had suspected this, and now he had it said aloud by a county employee behind a county window, and that was the specific thing he had driven up here to obtain. Something on the record. Something said by a third party in an official room. "Equal shares," he said again quietly. "That is what the original deed says. That is what we are asking this office to honor." "The original deed was superseded by the divorce settlement," I said. "The settlement established sole ownership in my name." That's what Diane pulled up first. "A settlement your attorney drafted," Douglas said. "Both attorneys reviewed it," I said. "Both attorneys signed off. So did Brendan." "Brendan was not in a position to fully understand what he was signing," Douglas said. Same words. Same pace. Same level tone. He had said it 3 times now, each time exactly the same, as if he had prepared it in advance and was delivering it as prepared. "He had an attorney," I said. "He had a young man from a Bellingham firm who billed him for 12 hours and produced a result that left him with the contents of a savings account and no home." Douglas's voice stayed level. "I'm not pretending that was a fair process. You have resources. You've always had resources. Your father's business, your firm, your professional standing in the marine insurance industry. Brendan is not in your position. He was not in your position when he was sitting across that table, and he is not in your position now." Carter said, "He's just trying to get back on his feet." I looked at Carter. He had said it quietly, to the space in front of him. He felt me looking and looked away. Diane had her hands folded on the counter. Douglas said, "I want you to think about what you're doing. Not just to Brendan. To yourself. You're going to live in that house by yourself, and you're going to drive past this family on your way to work, and you're going to see us at the harbor and the market and everywhere you go in this town, because this is a small town, Astrid, and you are not from it. Not really. Brendan is from it. His grandfather fished out of that harbor. His father worked in these yards for 30 years. And you," he paused. You came up from Astoria and you were with us for a while, and now you want to take a piece of us with you on your way out the door. I'm not on my way out, I said. Then what are you doing? He asked. I'm sitting in the county recorder's office, I said. With the deed to my house. Douglas held my eye for a moment. Then he looked at the folder on the counter. He had been aware of it since we sat down. I had watched his attention return to it at intervals during our conversation, the way attention returns to an unfamiliar object in a room you thought you knew well. Carter said, "She knows, Dad." He said it quietly, just above a murmur. Douglas looked at him. Carter looked at the floor. "What's in it?" Douglas said. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached for the folder. I pulled it toward me across the counter. I held it with both hands for a moment. Then I turned it so the edge faced Diane. I slid it across the counter toward her, slowly and without drama, and laid it flat on the surface in front of her. "This is for your records," I said. "The escrow settlement statement from the original purchase. The wire transfer confirmation from my savings account to the closing escrow, dated, notarized, showing the originating account number and the receiving escrow account number. The breakdown from the title company documenting the 60-40 contribution split, signed by both parties at closing. And the final divorce decree, page 11, section 4, which documents the legal basis for the sole ownership transfer and the court's findings regarding the purchase contribution disparity." Diane took the folder. She opened it. She read. She turned a page. She read again. She turned another page and looked at the wire confirmation for a long moment, cross-referencing something on her screen. Then she turned to the last document, which was the decree, and read from a specific section without speaking. Douglas was very still. Carter had stopped looking at the wall. Diane looked up. She looked at Douglas, then at me. "The transfer on record," she said, "is consistent with the documents you've provided. The settlement reflects a 60% purchase contribution by the sole current owner, with a corresponding adjustment to the ownership structure, reviewed and approved by the Skagit County Superior Court, Judge Ellen Marsh presiding." She paused. "The record is correct as filed." Douglas said nothing. The clock on the wall read 1:34 p.m. The ventilation system ran steadily. Traffic moved on the street outside, muffled through the window glass. Douglas looked at me. I looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had walked into a room that should not have existed and was now standing in the middle of it, working out what it meant for everything he had assumed about where the walls were. "You planned this," he said. I said nothing. "You knew," he said. "This morning. At the house. When you invited us. You already knew." I kept my voice even. "I did." He looked at the folder in Diane's hands. At the screen. At the counter. Then at my face. For the first time in 11 years I could not read what was behind his expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the patient, measured look he had worn since that morning. It was something without a name in the vocabulary Douglas Osgood used, the expression of a man who had prepared for every possible outcome except the correct one. He said, "I want you to know that my son is a good man." "I know he is," I said. "He deserves better than this." "He received what the court determined was equitable," I said. His attorney signed off. "So did he." "He trusted you," Douglas said. For the third time. The same words. But this time they came out differently, quieter, flatter, without the certainty of the first two times. Not an argument. Not a position. Just a fact about his son, standing alone in the room with nowhere further to go. "I know," I said. Douglas looked at me for one more moment. Then he turned and walked to the door. Carter followed. Just before the door swung open, Carter looked back over his shoulder, briefly, one beat, and his face had something in it I hadn't seen from him before. Not the nodding agreement of the morning, not the fixed attention to the ground. Something more like recognition. Something that belonged to him and not to his father. Then the door swung closed and they were gone. The room was quiet. Diane set the folder back on the counter. She looked at her screen. She typed something and pressed enter. The clock read 1:37 p.m. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" she asked. "No," I said. "Thank you." I picked up the folder. I stood. I buttoned my coat. I walked out through the lobby, through the main entrance and into the parking lot, which was wet and gray under the low clouds. Douglas's truck was gone. I stood beside my car for a moment. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet pavement and faintly salt from the direction of the harbor. Somewhere behind the municipal building a truck was reversing, the backup alarm going steadily, 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off, and then it stopped. Then there was only the sound of traffic on the main road and water moving in the gutter at the edge of the lot. My stomach dropped once, slow and complete, the way it does when something held in tension for a long time is finally released. Then it passed. Just once. Then it was done. I got in the car. I set the folder on the passenger seat. I put both hands on the wheel. Marlene had texted twice more while I was inside. The first at 1:19 p.m., Douglas just called me. Please Astrid. Please just talk to us. The second at 1:31, you don't have to do this. I read them once. I set the phone face down on the seat beside the folder. I started the car. The road back ran along the water. The sound was flat and gray and enormous under the cloud cover, and the afternoon ferry was making its crossing far out, a white shape moving very slowly from this distance. I watched it between the trees as the road curved north. I kept my speed steady. A logging truck came the other way and I moved right in the lane and kept going. I wasn't thinking about Douglas. I wasn't thinking about Marlene's texts or Carter's face at the door or the way the word trust had sounded the third time it was said. I was thinking about the road. I was thinking about the ferry. I was thinking about the fact that I was driving north along the water toward a house that had my name on the deed, and it was 1:48 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the rain had stopped. By 2:04 p.m., I was in my own driveway. I turned the engine off. I picked up the folder. I got out of the car. I went inside. I set the folder on the kitchen table. I took off my coat and hung it on the hook by the door. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner and turned it on. I stood at the window above the sink and looked at the backyard. The rain had come back, a fine steady mist that caught in the hemlock at the back of the lot and made the grass look dark. I watched it for a while. The kettle clicked off. I made tea. I left the bag in longer than I usually would. I brought the mug to the table and sat down. The folder was in front of me. It was the same folder it had been that morning, slightly worn at the corners, the label on the tab in my own handwriting dated. I had put it together 3 weeks ago. I had made 2 copies and left one with my attorney and kept this one. I had read through it many times. I knew everything in it. I moved the mug to the left. I pulled the folder toward me. I looked at the label for a moment. Then I opened it. The first document on top was the escrow settlement statement, the original dated with the title company's stamp. Below it was the wire confirmation, a single page. Below that was the title company's closing breakdown. And at the bottom, the divorce decree, page 11, section 4, with the relevant passage marked in pencil in a thin straight line along the margin. I had not put anything else in the folder. I turned the pages back to the beginning. I read the first line of the escrow statement. I already knew what it said, and I was still at the kitchen table at 4:30 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I had read through all 4 documents in the folder twice. I had drunk the first mug of tea while it was still warm and made a second and let it go cold. The decree was on top now, page 11 face up, the pencil line along the margin of section 4 visible from where I sat. I had been sitting with it for a long time. Not reading anymore. Just sitting in the same room with it, the way you sit with something that took a long time to arrive. I didn't answer the door immediately. I sat for one more moment. The kitchen light was on. Outside the window the yard was dark. The hemlock at the back of the lot caught what was left of the streetlight and held it in the needles. Then I went to the door. Marlene was on the porch. She was in her good coat, the navy wool one she wore to anything she wanted to be taken seriously in. Her hands were at her sides. Douglas stood behind her and slightly to the left, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the porch boards. He had parked the truck half a block down on the far side of the street. I noticed that. He usually pulled into the driveway. Carter was at the base of the steps. He had his hands in his jacket pockets too. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the street, at the wet pavement, at nothing in particular. Astrid, Marlene said. Please. I looked at all 3 of them. Marlene's face had the particular quality of a person who had been crying in the car on the way here and had tried to fix it before she rang the bell and had mostly succeeded. Her eyes were clear but slightly swollen at the lower lids. She had put on lipstick. Come in, I said. I stood back from the door. Marlene came in first, stopping briefly in the entryway to look at the side table and the co-track, taking inventory, the way she always did when she entered a house. Douglas came in behind her. Carter came last and stopped near the co-track with his arms at his sides, as if he hadn't fully decided whether he was part of this evening or an observer of it. I brought them to the kitchen. Marlene sat at the far end of the table. Douglas sat across from her. Carter stood in the kitchen doorway. He was taller than his father by an inch but carried himself smaller, shoulders slightly forward, the posture of a man who had learned that taking up less space was safer. I sat at the end of the table closest to me, where the open folder was. I left it open. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Long enough that the sound of traffic on the main road 2 blocks away became audible, then faded. Long enough that Carter shifted his weight once and the floorboard in the doorway creaked slightly, and then went still. Marlene said, "I know you're angry at us." "I'm not angry," I said. She looked at me with the particular expression of a woman who believes, genuinely, that the person she is talking to does not understand their own interior state. "Astrid," she said, "you've been through something terrible. We all have. Divorce is terrible. No one in this family wanted this. We don't blame you for wanting to protect yourself." She paused. "But protecting yourself and doing what's right aren't always the same thing. You know that. You're a smart woman. You've always been a smart woman. That's one of the things I admired about you from the beginning." "Thank you," I said. She looked briefly at Douglas, then back at me. "I need you to hear me. Not as someone who's been through a legal process with paperwork and attorneys. Just as a mother." She kept her voice quiet and even. "What it is to watch your son try to put himself back together in that apartment, knowing that 4 blocks away is the place where he should be. Where he belongs. It's not about the money. It's not what the deed says. It's the fact that that house is where Brendan became who he is. Where he came into himself as a man. And I know you loved him. I believe that. I've always believed that. And I believe that somewhere in you right now you still know what the right thing is." I let the silence hold. I kept my hands flat on the table and didn't answer immediately, because anything I said in the first 3 seconds would have sounded like a refusal before she'd finished. "Marlene," I said, "I know you love Brendan. I know you believe every word of what you just said. But this is not something I'm going to change my mind about." She shook her head slowly. "You have your firm. You have your family in Astoria. You have everything you came in with and more. You could start over somewhere new. Brendan has nothing right now. He's trying to rebuild from nothing." "Brendan has what the court gave him," I said. "A savings account and a truck," she said. "And a settlement his attorney reviewed and he signed," I said. "His attorney was 29 years old," Douglas said. "Just a fact." "His attorney was licensed and present and representing him," I said. Douglas said, "We're prepared to make this worth your while financially. The family can put something together so you're not walking away with less than you came in with." "I'm not walking away," I said. "I'm staying in my house." He looked at me. He put both hands flat on the table slowly, the way he did when he was settling into a position. "Then I need to tell you something plainly, Astrid, because you've always responded to plain speaking. If this goes back into litigation, and there are grounds, the duress argument exists and there are attorneys in this state who handle exactly these cases, it will take 2 years and it will cost you legal fees. A title with a question attached to it. A cloud on every transaction you try to do with that property for the duration of the challenge." He paused. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what the landscape looks like." "You said this at the recorder's office," I said. "I'm saying it again," he said, "because I meant it." "I heard you the first time," I said. "My answer is the same." He looked at me. Not with the patience anymore, with something more like genuine puzzlement, the puzzlement of a man who has made what he believes is a reasonable argument and cannot understand why it is not working. "What would it take?" he said. It came out differently than his other questions, quieter, more direct, less constructed. A man asking because he genuinely didn't know. "What do you need from us? What do you need from this family to put this behind you without it becoming a legal matter?" "There's nothing," I said. "The court resolved it." Carter said something from the doorway. He said it quietly, almost to himself, and for a moment I wasn't certain he'd said anything at all. Then he said it again, "She's right." Douglas looked at him. "She's right," Carter said. He looked at the floor. His voice was careful, flat, the voice of a man who has thought about what he is going to say for a while and has decided to say it anyway. Brendan signed. His lawyer was there. We were in the hallway. I watched him sign it. He knew what he was doing. He didn't want to fight it anymore. He paused. I'm not saying I think everything worked out right. I'm saying it was his choice and he made it. Douglas said, Carter. Just the name. I know, Carter said. He looked at the wall. The kitchen was quiet again. Not the quiet of before, something heavier. Douglas looked at the table. He looked at the open folder. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up at me. Can I ask you something? Yes, I said. If the situation were reversed, he said. If it was Brendan sitting here and it was your family at this table asking him to think about what was right, what would you want him to do? I looked at him for a moment. If Brendan had put in 60%, I said. If his name were in the decree the way mine is and his records were what mine are, would you be sitting at this table right now asking him to give it back? Douglas held my eye. The refrigerator clicked on. The rain came back briefly, a light tap against the window glass and then stopped. He didn't answer. That's not the situation, he said. No, I said. But it's a useful thing to sit with. Marlene looked at her hands. She turned her wedding ring once, the way she did when she was thinking. Then she stopped. I want you to look at something, I said. I turned the folder toward the center of the table. Not handing it over, just orienting the text toward them so they could read it from where they sat. Marlene leaned forward. She could see the case number at the top, the court name, the judge's name, the section heading. Page 11, I said. Section 4. The court's findings on the purchase contribution and the basis for the ownership transfer. Marlene reached out and pulled the folder toward her by the corner. She read slowly. I watched her eyes move line by line. She reached the passage about the 60% contribution and stopped. She read it twice. Then she kept going. Her face went still in a way I hadn't seen from her before, not the controlled stillness of her husband, but the stillness of something landing that she hadn't been ready for. She looked up at me. Astrid. Keep reading, I said. All the way to the end of the section. She looked back down. She read to the end. Then she slid the folder across to Douglas without speaking. He read it the way he read everything, going back to check a phrase when it wasn't clear, taking his time, not rushing. He went through the section once. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly. He looked at the pencil line along the margin. He looked at the judge's name. Then he sat back. The court made a finding, he said. Yes, I said. Based on the wire records and the escrow documentation your attorney submitted. The same documents I gave Diane at the recorder's office this afternoon, I said. The same documents that have been in that folder for 3 weeks. He was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the folder, at the open page, at the pencil line. You prepared this, he said. Yes, I said. Before this morning. 3 weeks ago, I said. I had 2 copies made. One with my attorney. One in the cabinet. He looked at the folder. He didn't speak. The court's finding isn't the same as what's right, he said finally. No, I said. But it is the final word on who holds the deed. And it will be the final word if this goes to litigation again, because the records don't change. Something shifted in his face then, something that had been held in position all day by will and by habit finally became too heavy to hold. Not anger. Something older and more tired. I spent 30 years in those boatyards, he said. He wasn't arguing anymore. Just saying it, the way a man says a thing that has been true for a long time and has only now become heavy enough to feel. Building something my sons could stand on. Something that would last. And I look at Brendan in that apartment and I ask myself, what did I build it for? What was any of it for? I let the silence hold. Marlene said softly, we thought you were part of what he was building. I was, I said. For 11 years. And in those years I contributed to this family in ways that weren't small, and that I never mentioned, and that weren't repaid. The boatyard payroll loan when Douglas's client was late. The kitchen renovation. Carter's attorney fees. 3 years of condition reports for the yard at cost of materials. The boundary dispute with your neighbor, the plat records, the assessor's office meeting, the 40-minute drive each way. I kept my voice level. Just the record. I did those things because I was part of this family, and that's what you do when you're part of a family. I didn't keep a ledger. I didn't expect anything back. Marlene was very still. Carter had both hands in his pockets and was looking at the wall beside the refrigerator. I'm telling you now, I said, not to argue about it, but because you came here this evening to ask me to do one more thing for this family, and I want you to understand what this family has asked of me over 11 years and what it has given back. I paused. The answer is still no. Douglas said, we're asking you to do the right thing. I looked at him. You told me this morning, I said, and I kept my voice exactly where it had been all day, steady and level, the same voice I had used in the driveway and at the recorder's office and now here, in my own kitchen at my own table, that this house was never mine. You said it loud enough for the neighbor across the street to stop walking. That this house was never mine. He said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. It is mine, I said. I have the wire confirmation, the escrow statement, the title company breakdown, and the signed decree of a Skagit County Superior Court judge that says it is mine. That is the first thing. His jaw tightened. He looked at the folder. He held my eye for a long moment. He didn't move. His hands were still on the table. I could see his jaw working, not speaking, just the small movement of a man holding something back that has run out of form. He looked at the folder one more time. At the pencil line. At his own hands. Then he looked back at me with the expression of a man who has held a position all day and finds himself at the end of the day still holding it, which is not the same thing as winning. Marlene said, Astrid, please. You told me today, I said, that I'm not part of this family anymore. That I stopped being an Osgood when I filed the papers. That I'm living inside something that doesn't belong to me. I kept looking at Douglas. You're right that I'm not an Osgood. I'm Astrid Thorvald. I always was. And I'm going to live in this house and work at my firm and be in this town for as long as I choose. That is the second thing. Douglas said, we're not done with. And you told me, I said, 3 times today. At my door this morning. At the recorder's office this afternoon. And here at this table 40 minutes ago. You told me that Brendan trusted me. I held his eye. He did. And I was honest with this family for 11 years. The settlement is honest. The records are honest. The deed reflects exactly what happened at that closing. Everything in that folder is exactly what it says it is. I paused. That is the third thing, Douglas. And there is nothing else to discuss. He held my eye for a long moment. Then he stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and straightened it with both hands. He looked at Marlene. Let's go, he said. Marlene stood slowly. She looked at me across the table and her eyes were wet, steady but wet. I hope someday you'll understand what you did to this family, she said. I understand it now, I said. I understand it well. She held my eye for a moment. Then she looked around the kitchen once more, the counter, the table, the cabinet. That inventory. Then she looked away. Carter was already in the hallway. He stopped near the front door. He looked at me once, that expression, the one without a name that belonged only to him, and said very quietly, I'm sorry, Astrid. Thank you, Carter, I said. He nodded once. Then he went out. I walked them to the door. Douglas went out to the porch and down the steps without looking back. Marlene paused at the threshold. Take care of yourself, she said. I will, I said. She went. I stood in the open doorway. The cold air came in from outside carrying salt and wet pavement, the smell of the harbor a quarter-mile away. I had stood in this doorway before at this hour. Coming in from the cold after a late survey. Coming back from a drive with nowhere to be. Once, a week after Brendan left, standing here for 15 minutes before I could decide to go inside. The doorway was the same. The air from the harbor was the same. I watched them walk to the truck, parked half a block down under the streetlight, on the far side of the street. Carter got in the back. Marlene got in the front. Douglas stood by the driver's door for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, looking in the direction of the harbor. Standing very still. Then he opened the door and got in. The interior light came on and then off when the door closed. A beat of stillness. Then the engine started. The headlights came on. The truck pulled slowly from the curb, turned at the corner and disappeared. The street was quiet. The rain had stopped completely. The air was cold and still, and the wet pavement caught the streetlight and held it in long smears of yellow and white all the way to the corner. Somewhere behind the houses to the east a dog barked twice and stopped. From the direction of the harbor, faint, shapeless by the time it reached me, the ferry horn went once. Low and long. The way it always went at this hour. I stood in the doorway and listened to it until it was finished. Then I listened to the quiet that came after it. That was different from the quiet before. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I went to the kitchen. I picked up the cold mug from the counter and carried it to the sink and poured it out. I rinsed the mug and set it in the rack. I turned off the burner I had left on for hours. I looked at the folder on the table. I picked it up. I held it for a moment, the slight weight of it, the worn corners. Then I carried it to the cabinet beside the desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one where I kept the important files, the firm documents, the insurance binder, the tax records going back 7 years, and I put the folder inside, and I closed the cabinet door. The folder was in there with the rest of the firm records where it belonged. I stood at the window above the sink and looked at the backyard. The hemlock was still. No wind. The yard was dark and quiet and entire. I didn't eat dinner that night. I wasn't hungry. I sat in the living room for a while with the lights on low. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I sat in the chair by the window, the one I had moved that Marlene had noticed, and I looked at the street through the glass. It was empty. The streetlight at the corner did what it always did. A car passed on the main road. Then nothing. At some point I fell asleep in the chair. I woke at 2:11 a.m. with a stiff neck and the lights still on and the house entirely quiet around me. I went to bed. I slept until 6 a.m. I lay there for a while in the dark listening to the harbor. No ferry horn at this hour, that came later at 7 at the first crossing. Just the sounds the house made, the heat running, a branch moving against the siding, rain again, soft and steady. I got up. I made coffee. I stood at the window above the sink the way I had stood there yesterday morning, and the morning before that, and the morning before that. The yard was dark. The hemlock was moving slightly. The light was beginning at the eastern edge of the sky, a thin and very pale gray line above the tree line. Nothing dramatic. Just the beginning of the light the way it always began here in November. I had work to do. I went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen. On the shelf above the desk, between the marine insurance reference volumes and a stack of condition report templates, was a wooden case about the size of a shoebox. Flat-lidded, dark-stained oak with a brass latch. My father had used it for 30 years. When he retired from field work, he had handed it to me across the kitchen table in Astoria without saying anything in particular, the way he handed off most things he valued, as if the value were self-evident and didn't require annotation. Inside the case were his survey dividers. Brass. 8 inches with calibrated legs, a tension adjustment at the hinge, and the initials of the man who had made them stamped into the inside of one leg, a marine instrument maker in Bellingham who had been out of business for 20 years. My father had used these dividers to walk distances across chart paper, to measure spans, to confirm what the eyes told him and the hull confirmed. I had used them too in the early years. I used a digital plotter now for most of that work, but I kept the dividers on the shelf above the desk, in the oak case latched. I opened the case. I took the dividers out. I set them on the desk beside the condition report I had been working on before all of this started, a survey of a 43-foot commercial vessel out of Anacortes, due before Friday. I hadn't touched the report in 2 days. I looked at it now. The hull measurements were all there. The frame inspection notes. The running gear documentation. Everything I needed to write it. The dividers lay on the desk beside the papers, brass and cool, catching the kitchen light. My father had spent 30 years getting things right in situations where getting it wrong meant something, meant a denied claim, a disputed vessel, a policy that didn't hold. He had taught me that accuracy was not a style choice. It was the job. The job was to describe what was actually there, not what you hoped was there, not what would have been more convenient to find. And if what was actually there was inconvenient for someone, that was not your problem. You wrote what the hull told you. I had done that yesterday. In a county office with a clerk named Diane, and at my own kitchen table with 3 people who wanted a different answer, and at my front door before any of it. All day in every room with every document. I picked up the dividers. I held them for a moment the way I always held them when I took them out, feeling the weight, the calibration of the tension at the hinge, the slight warmth that brass holds. My father's hands had held these. Every survey he had ever walked, he had walked with these. There was nothing mystical about it. They were a tool that had been used well for a long time and would continue to be used well. Some things you carry from the people who taught you how to work, and the best thing you can do with them is keep working. I set the dividers down. I sat at the desk. The manila folder was in the cabinet where I had filed it. That was where it belonged. I opened the condition report. I found my place in the documentation and I began where I had left off, working through the hull notes in the order they needed to go, frame by frame, compartment by compartment, the way my father had taught me, the way I had taught myself in the years since, the way I would still be doing it long after this week was a thing that had happened and receded and become part of the record of the house. Outside, the ferry horn went once at 7 a.m. low and long. The first crossing. I kept working. By 8:30 a.m. I had the inspection section drafted. By 9:15 the running gear documentation was complete. I made a second cup of coffee. I stood at the window for a moment and looked at the yard, the hemlock in the morning light, wet still, the grass dark and heavy with the overnight rain. The light was fully up now. Gray the way it was most days in November, but full. Enough to work by. I went back to the desk. At some point I realized the house was very quiet, and that the quiet was not empty. It was just quiet. The sounds of a house in the morning, the heat, the harbor, the occasional car on the street. Sounds I had always known here, sounds that had been here before yesterday morning and were here now and would be here tomorrow and the day after. They had not changed. The house had not changed. The address on the survey report I was writing, the address I had typed in the upper right corner the way I typed it on every document that came from this office, read Thorvald Marine Survey, with the street address beneath it. That was right. That had always been right. I finished the report at 11:47 a.m. I read it once. I made one correction to a frame measurement notation in the third compartment. I read it again. Then I signed it and applied the firm seal, my father's seal, the same seal, Thorvald Marine Survey, the one that had been on every piece of work we had put into the world for more than 40 years. It leaves a clean raised impression in the paper when you close the handles. I set the sealed report on the edge of the desk to be filed. I looked at the brass dividers lying beside it. I picked them up. I put them back in the oak case. I closed the lid. I snapped the brass latch. I put the case back on the shelf between the reference volumes and the condition report templates, where it had always been. If this story found you at a moment when you needed to hear it, I hope it helped. Share it with someone who's been told that what's theirs isn't. There are people who understand exactly what it costs to hold on, quietly, without raising your voice, with nothing but the record and your own name on the deed. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.